Well, we wondered today whether we'd get a budget or a leadership bid, and I got to say we didn't get much of either. You can tell how big the crisis in the health service is. The health service didn't even get a mention. Now, cut through all the rhetoric, and what we've got is a Chancellor who's taxed too much, borrowed too much, and is the roadblock to reform. He is a politician completely stuck in the past. Now, of course, there are some things in the budget that we welcome, not least because we proposed them. I particularly welcome what the Chancellor had to say about independent statistics and youth volunteering. We will look carefully at the detail, but I like what is happening. I come up with the ideas, he puts them in his budget. Now, the Chancellor made a lot of this... Bye-bye. The Chancellor made a lot of the changes to the climate change levy, but he still hasn't addressed the real problem. It's a tax on energy, not a charge on carbon. And that's why carbon emissions keep going up. Now, the Chancellor's just announced a new Environment Institute, but this is the same Chancellor who's closing the very laboratories that do the research into climate change. This was not a genuinely green budget, and that's not surprising, because this Chancellor hasn't made a single major speech on the environment in 11 years. In a carbon-conscious world, we've got a fossil fuel Chancellor. Now, I congratulate the Chancellor for what he had to say about the Olympics. I don't want to overdo it, because he's just spent an hour congratulating himself. Now, the Chancellor told us that his borrowing forecasts were correct. Yes, he correctly forecast that the public finances are in a mess. He's borrowing £37 billion this year. He told us that his economic growth forecasts were correct. Yes, he correctly forecast that Britain would grow more slowly than the United States, Canada, the G7, Spain, Ireland, the OECD and Australia. I know the Chancellor and the Prime Minister only get to talk to each other once a year on Budget Day, but they ought to listen to this bit. We will study the rest of the budget carefully, because after 10 budgets, we know this Chancellor's budget speeches bear very little relation to the budget itself. He told us about the savings culture, but why didn't he tell us that on page 238 of the Red Book, or in the Prime Minister's case, the unread book, that it says the savings ratio is only 5.75%. That is half of what it was when he came to office. Why didn't he tell us that business investment at 9% is a record low? And he didn't tell us that today he's actually revised the figure downwards compared with 3 months ago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are two central facts which tell us the real story of this budget. First...
Order. Sorry to interrupt the right honourable gentleman. The Chancellor was listened to with very... Order. The honourable member will be removed if he behaves like that. That one expects a certain reaction to all these things. The Chancellor was heard in relative silence. And the same courtesy should be offered to the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Democrat Party afterwards. Mr. David Cameron.
There are two central facts that tell the story of this budget. First, the tax burden is now at its highest ever level in the history of this country. Higher than when Dennis Healey made the pip squeak. Higher than when Ramsay MacDonald was sitting where the Prime Minister is now. People who listened to the budget will have noticed the second fact. Even with the highest tax burden in Britain's history, the government is borrowing £175 billion over the next 6 years. I know that the Chancellor is a man in a hurry, but that is no excuse for belting out figures like some supercharged bookmaker. Let me go through the figures in turn. He's going to borrow £37 billion this year, then £36 billion, then £30 billion, then £25 billion, then £24, then £23. That is £175 billion over 6 years. This Chancellor is mortgaging this country's future. That is over £1,000 of debt for every household in this country. Those are the facts. For all of the years of spin about enterprise, about prudence, we've finally got to the truth. He's an old-fashioned tax and spend chancellor. And that approach is completely out of date. The story of this week is of a Prime Minister and a Chancellor up to their necks in debt, making promises they can't keep, and not knowing whether to work together or fight with each other as the ship starts going down. The real challenge facing this country is competing in the new global economy. And the Chancellor, who's given us the biggest tax burden in Britain's history, cannot be the right person to meet that challenge. We used to have the 10th lowest business taxes in the developed world. We've now got the 10th highest. He's had 10 budgets to boost science, but we've got science departments in our universities closing. He's had 10 budgets to improve transport, and some of our motorways look like car parks. He cannot be the change this country needs because he's the architect of the policies that have put us where we are. This country also faces a huge challenge to reform public services. The Chancellor, who squandered billions of pounds on unreformed public services, cannot be the right person to meet that challenge. He's doubled spending on the health service, but this weekend one hospital sacked almost 1,000 staff. Deficits across the NHS have now reached £1 billion. He's doubled spending on education, but more than half our children leave school without the required standard. Mr. Deputy Speaker, billions raised, billions spent, no idea where the money's gone. With a record like that, the Chancellor should be running for Treasurer of the Labour Party. And the Chancellor in his budget mentioned pensions. After everything he's done, millions of people in this country will think he's got a nerve. This is the Chancellor who took £5 billion out of the nation's pension funds. This is the Chancellor whose means testing destroyed savings. We didn't even get a mention of whether his pre-election bribe of £200 would be continued. I expect we'll have to find that in the Red Book. This is the Chancellor who led the Right Honourable Member for Birkenhead, their first pension minister, and the only one who was any good, to say, when Labour came to power, we had one of the strongest pension provisions in Europe. Now we've got one of the weakest. The Chancellor who smashed up the pension system cannot be the right person to rebuild it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Labour MPs may think the Chancellor's their salvation from the mess they find themselves in this week. But when you look at the big failures of this government, not the sleaze and the spin, but the failures of policy, they are the Chancellor's failures. The failure to spend money wisely, the failure to reform public services, the failure to protect people's pensions, the failure to prepare for Britain's future. Those failures are made in Downing Street, number 10, number 11. The Chancellor may see himself as the rock upon which Labour can rebuild their church. Instead, he's the roadblock stopping Britain from meeting the challenges of the future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, he's an analogue politician in a digital age. Mr. Deputy Speaker, he is the past.